So it kind of went from this love of audio video in middle school, high school, to taking a course on calibration, getting a degree in video production, but kind of staying on that technical side of things, and then working with one of the masters in our industry, and then just sort of growing that into a business. And it's funny how it goes that way. I never really thought it was going to be this huge business that I'd be doing full time, and it would be everything. It was more of like a fascination with displays and image quality that just kind of grew in very naturally over the last 17 years now.
On this episode of the Colorist podcast, we're trying something a little different. We take a break from talking with a colorist to focus on something a bit more technical. Dave Abrams, monitor calibrator and owner of Avical, joins me on this episode. It's about to get seriously geeky and in the best possible way. Dave has been calibrating monitors for over 17 years. He's been through the transitions from SD to HD, tape and film to file-based, and now 4K and HDR. Post facilities from all over the world rely on his expertise and knowledge of monitors to get the most consistent and accurate monitoring possible. High-end home theater owners also use his services to get a great-looking image at home. And seeing both sides of each situation gives him a great perspective on the industry as a whole. On this podcast, we talk about how HDR is changing the approach to calibration, the differences between calibrating by the numbers and when to go by your instincts, the HP Dreamcolor, ISO, and other computer monitors for color critical evaluation. And now, here's Dave Abrams. Well, thanks, Dave, for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Briefly, give us some background. How did you get started in calibration? It's not generally something that people directly go to, so how did you get started?
It isn't something that you directly go to. Maybe more and more these days, people are starting to think about it as a career. But when I got started, it really was derived from a love of movies and a love of television. And as a middle schooler, high schooler, I would read all the audio video magazines I could get my hands on, Stereophile and audio video interiors, and take a look at all the beautiful homes and systems out there. And from there, I kind of wanted to go into a career that involved audio video. And as I was learning more and more about it, I learned about the Imaging Science Foundation and calibration and how it was this big thing that was up and coming and how important it was. And I went to an ISF seminar, one of these seminars that they teach all over the world now. And it's a couple days long. And you kind of get a crash course in basic video technology and video theory. What is a grayscale? What is gamma? What's a color space, color gamut, those types of things. And then you're meant to take that education and sort of build on it, right? So the seminar is kind of giving you that crash course and all these things you need to know. And then they want their graduates to kind of move on and get equipment and start learning and growing that education from the ground. Well, when I took it, I was actually a senior in high school. I just graduated high school and I was about to go to college for video production. Because if you wanted to get into calibration, you wanted to get in that audio video world, there were really only a couple paths to go. One of them was, at the time, electrical engineering. You could go and learn electrical engineering, learn how to build a toaster, build a TV, build a refrigerator. And the other was, you could go into video production. And of course, a lot of accredited video production programs will teach you a lot of background, right? They'll teach you about the background of images and what a CCD is and lenses and back focus and all these things that go into making content. So not necessarily wanting to go into that really heavy electrical engineering field, I ended up going into video production and kind of took my calibration education and just applied that throughout the entire program at Ithaca College where I studied and just stayed on that technical path. And I was very fortunate that through Ithaca College, they have a Los Angeles program where I got to intern with Joe Kane, who is one of the founders of the Imaging Science Foundation and also kind of a legend in the video calibration world. He makes a lot of test patterns. He sits on a lot of the SMPTE committees and contributes to a lot of the standards. And he kind of took me under his wing, and I was able to come out here for a semester, work with him, and really study a lot more about calibration, which only made me love it more. Like, the more you learn about it and how intricate it is and how many things, it's sort of, well, I guess a chocolate lover in a candy store. You're there and you're just playing with all these great toys and learning what makes them tick and how to adjust them. And I graduated, and Joe actually offered me a job. So I worked on some of the test pattern discs that are on the market, like Digital Video Essentials. I helped with those as an assistant and kept calibrating. I kept calibrating throughout college and then on the side. And when I was working with Joe, I started calibrating with some of the studios, and then it just sort of became a full-time career. So it kind of went from this love of audio video in middle school, high school, to taking a course on calibration, getting a degree in video production, but kind of staying on that technical side of things, and then working with one of the masters in our industry, and then just sort of growing that into a business. And it's funny how it goes that way. I never really thought it was going to be this huge business that I'd be doing full-time, and it would be everything. It was more of like a fascination with displays and image quality that just kind of grew in very naturally over the last 17 years now into where I am today.
And at the point that you started, was it all SD?
Yeah, well, when I started, we were transitioning from SD to HD. HD TV Rec 709, right, was written in 1991, I believe. The standard was written. And 1990, 1991, if I remember correctly. And HD started rolling out to consumers, I think, the late 90s. There wasn't a ton of it. It was very new. It was like that new early technology. But late 90s, it was rolling out. So I started calibrating right when it was kind of hitting the market. But it was still a lot of CRTs, the cathode ray tube televisions, and then the big rear projection TVs with the red, green, and blue CRT guns. And that's where I kind of got my chops. It was opening these up and focusing these TVs and working on convergence and adjusting potentiometers inside the displays to try and balance the grayscale. And it was very much like that until 2005, 2007. It started to really get away from that, and we started to see the transition from the CRT more into LCDs and plasma displays. Which, of course, you don't really open up ever. You don't need to open them up. You don't need to focus them. A lot of it's digital controls, whether you're connecting a computer to it to make the adjustments, or whether you're going into a secret menu, or even just the user menu nowadays to get into grayscale, gamma, color gamut, and those type of adjustments. So HDTV, yeah, it was sort of up and coming, and then it became the standard, and now we're seeing the transition from HD to Ultra HD and high dynamic range and all these new formats.
Yeah, and you've seen all of these different formats come and go too, like LCD and plasma, now OLED. So what do you see most of in your travels around to different facilities, and where do you think things are going?
I see just about everything, because all we do is calibrate, right? So all I'm doing is running around all day going from client to client and calibrating monitors. So you see the vast array of LCD computer monitors. LCDs are still extremely strong in computer displays, obviously. We see them in conference rooms. We see them in homes. OLED technology is sort of taking the lead in terms of overall picture quality. We're seeing a lot more, especially in the colorist world, we're seeing a lot more OLED. It has the contrast ratio, that beautiful black level like a plasma used to have. It has a wide angle of view, which is one of the biggest things we hear from customers about LCDs. If you have a review room or a client monitor and you're using an LCD, you start walking around that LCD or putting yourself in different positions within the room, and it looks a little different because you have saturation shifts, off-axis issues with that technology. And as OLED kind of overcomes more of that and gets the quality better, we're seeing a lot more people switch to the OLED technology in terms of color grading bays. LCDs still extremely prominent. Again, computer monitors, visual effects artists, people working in Photoshop. Most of these people are working on computer displays, which are predominantly LCD. And then even in the home, there are situations where an OLED might not be the best solution. OLEDs don't get as bright as today's LCD display. So if you have a room with high ambient light or a conference room with high ambient light, you tend to shift towards a display that's going to still have a level of brightness that's going to be pleasing given the room environment that you're in.
The room can have a huge impact on what's going on with the monitor as well. So Do your clients look to you when they consider the design or the lighting for the room?
At times they do. At times we have clients that we've worked with for quite a while that when they're upgrading or they're moving to a new room or facility, they'll reach out and say, hey, Dave, we're setting up a new screening room and I just want to get some input on what can we do to make sure we have it as accurate as we can. But that's kind of few and far between. We're sort of the fix-it guys. So a lot of times people have purchased their products, they've set up their rooms, and now they're like, okay, now I'm ready for calibration. And we more often walk into a room and say, oh, okay, I would install a bias light behind the monitor because you don't have one. And, oh, well, I'm just using this light that's in the corner there. Yeah, but you can see the reflection off the display. It's not the proper color temperature of D65. And, it is going to skew your perception of the monitor. And so we'll walk into situations more like that where we give suggestions to customers sort of after the fact. But there are a few times where people will reach out and say, hey, can you give us some advice? Can you help point us in the right direction of setting this up? Should we use a neutral gray paint or can we keep these red walls that just came with the unit? You'd be surprised and you walk into some places and you're like, okay, this is a white ceiling and, red trim and there's a window right behind the monitor. And so there's a lot of things that can skew the perception within the room and kind of take you away from that reference grade experience.
Right. And diplomatically, you kind of have to approach those as well. Like, well, maybe you don't want to have that reflection on the monitor at this point, or maybe you want to consider painting the room, or do you just kind of calibrate it the best you can and then it is what it is?
The good part about video display calibration, right, the best part about it versus, say, an audio calibrator is the video calibration is often independent of the room environment. So when I'm measuring the display and doing that D65 grayscale, I don't actually want to measure the light in the room. I want to measure the light off the display. So I can calibrate the display, with a poor room environment that might get upgraded later, or maybe drapes are put in later, as long as the room is dark enough and we can set it up so that we don't have room environment being an issue of the measurements, we can calibrate the display. Whereas an audio guy, he might come in and go, oh, you have all these reflections and we need to deal with those reflections before we can really tune the system. So we now have to put in, a bass trap, or we have to put in, sound treatments on the walls, or we have to move this couch. And so it can become very, for an audio person, it may become very involved, right? And the room is so important to what they do, whereas the room is very important to what we do as video system calibrators. But it can be worked around and then things can be changed later. If, it's a consumer's home, oftentimes consumers aren't going to want to change their living room just to get a little better picture quality, although some do. Some are very much like, I don't care. I'm going to get a blackout shade because you told me to. So in those types of situations, we'll calibrate as best we can. Then we kind of try to calibrate for the room environment. So if it's an extremely bright environment, you have a client and they have a gorgeous view of the ocean and they don't want to cover up their view of the ocean, but they like watching Sunday football, you're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to create a picture mode for you that's brighter, and maybe we'll knock the gamma down from, the standard of 1886 2.4 to a 2.2 because it's going to be hard to see those dark level details. And then we'll try to make an ideal mode for nighttime viewing, for movie viewing, where it is more perfect to specification because of that room environment. But with colorists, you don't try to do that too much because colorists, you're trying to hit that standard. You're trying to get as perfect as you possibly can. So when we're at the studios, we're really trying to target the standard as perfectly as possible. And then we really do just make those suggestions, if there are those suggestions to make, of I would recommend a bias light. I would maybe cover up that window because I notice you're getting reflections off that. Sometimes it's even just wiring. I notice you're running this way and you might want to run this in RGB 444 because of X on this monitor instead of 422. And so sometimes we'll get into those types of things, but it's not too prevalent for us at the moment.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point too, because there is the numbers portion of calibration where it's either right or it's wrong. But then, as you were saying, with like somebody having this beautiful ocean view, you may want to actually think about how it's being used in its environment too. So how do you balance that?
At times that can come into play with LCDs. Most often you're calibrating an LCD with what we call local dimming turned off. And what local dimming is it takes a display and it reduces the backlight of the display, so the brightness based on areas of the display itself. So think about you have a 16:9 monitor and you might make it into 32 squares, right? You divide it evenly into 32 squares, and those might be your local dimming zones. And if you have a bright sun in two of those squares will get brighter, right? The backlight will get brighter, and then you have a nighttime alley or like a shadow of a building on the other side of the display, that part of the backlight's going to reduce to give you more contrast. Well, when you calibrate and you put up a 10% gray window and then a 20% gray window, 30% gray, the dynamic dimming, the local dimming, wants to fight that, right? So it says, oh, this is getting brighter. I need to boost my backlight to make it look brighter. And so your gamma's completely wrong. So you look at it and you go, well, wait, I'm measuring gamma and I'm fighting this arbitrary control that's meant to increase contrast on display. So we'll turn that off, calibrate, and then often if you're looking at display with it off, you go, wow, these blacks, the black level is not very good. It's not as rich and deep as I'm used to. So then you may turn that back on, right? And so for consumers, you're pretty much always using the local dimming after the calibration. You dial it in, and then the algorithm that controls that backlight is sort of what makes a display better than another, right? A Samsung or a Sony or an LG. Which one do you like the best? Well, who has the best algorithm maybe to control that backlight where it's not hurting my image too much, but ultimately it is altering the image. But you do have to make some of those artistic decisions where you go, yeah, but the black levels get so much better. The contrast goes so much up. And I don't think I've had a consumer that has looked at me and said, I kind of like the local dimming off. But in post-production, we kind of have to keep it off because then you're color grading against something that changes. And I've had clients who've purchased monitors as, say, a client monitor before I even come out to calibrate. And they'll say, I noticed I pause on something and then the display sort of dims itself. Or then I hit play and all of a sudden it gets brighter. And it might be because that local dimming, you paused on something and it reacts and says, oh, this is a slightly dimmer image. I'm going to dim myself down. And then you go to a slightly brighter and someone walks outside into the sunlight and all of a sudden you see it kind of pump. Some people will refer to it as like pumping of the display because you see it kind of pump and get a little brighter because it's not real time. It can't be that fast yet, I should say. Maybe one day we'll get fast enough where the response of the panel, the response of the backlight is fast enough. But what it's doing is it's analyzing the image, right? So it looks at the image, looks at the waveform, looks at the data and says, oh, this needs to get brighter. And then it kind of pumps it. It ramps it up, ramps it down. And unfortunately, it's not instantaneous. So you can see, especially a colorist working, going frame by frame, you can see it sort of shift, which again, you're fighting against something that's not really image levels and image quality. It's part of the display itself. With a reference display, really, we want the display to be a null. We want it to just be calibrated to the standard, hitting that standard. And then we want the colorists and the directors and the artists to create their vision of this is how I want my movie to look. This is how I want my TV show to look. And I know that if I do it this way to this spec, then I look at it in another display and another display and another display, it's going to be nearly the same from display to display to display. And if you have something where the display isn't a null, right, it's actually adding its own interpretation of the signal and adjusting itself to compensate, then you won't have that across the board. So in post-production, we don't really like that. In consumers, it really comes down to what they're trying to achieve in their room environment. But with an OLED, you don't have that. That's one of the reasons we like the OLEDs so much more than some of the LCDs today, although there are some amazing LCDs, don't get me wrong. And for HDR, if we get an HDR, LCDs kind of hold the crown of brightness, but.
So it's interesting too, because, when a lot of colorists start, if they're setting up their own room, they'll say, oh, maybe I'll just get a consumer TV to grade on. And as you said, there's all kinds of pitfalls that can happen with that. But around 2008, HP came out with their Dream Color monitor, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Since then, we've always encountered this question on forums like Lift Gamma Gain. And the question is, what's the least that I can spend on a monitor, or can I color with a computer monitor? And it just sends the forums into complete chaos at some point. For those people that are just starting out in the industry and they want something color critical to grade with, what would you recommend?
That's a tough question. So computer monitor is not really a monitor meant for grading broadcast content. It's not necessarily designed and engineered that way. And so Dream Colors are excellent, and Azo, excellent monitors. All the monitors out there kind of have their pros and cons. And more computer monitors today that are on the market from various manufacturers can be calibrated very well, especially when you're talking about something like Rec 709. We've gotten to the point where Rec 709 is pretty easy to achieve in pretty much any display technology. And what I mean by that is you're able to hit the 100 nits of brightness that we want to target. You're able to really get that gamma curve that we're trying to achieve, whether it's 2.2, 2.4, 1886, that happens to be somewhere in between there based on the measurements of the display itself, and hitting the color space, the color gamut of the display. Most displays these days can hit Rec 709. It's not hard anymore. You get into differences with off-axis viewing. You get into differences with contrast ratios between displays and frequency responsive displays and things like that. But once you start to get outside of that and you start going into things like P3, Rec 2020, Adobe RGB, and you start getting into wider color gamuts, that's where we start to see the bigger difference nowadays within these displays. So depending on what you're working on, right? So if you're just looking for a computer monitor for HD broadcast work, Rec 709 broadcast work, there's a lot of options out there. And as you get into higher end monitors like the Dream Color, like the Azo monitors, calibration becomes easier to do on them. Like Dream Color, of course, has developed a calibration process that allows you to get more consistent results through their software, through the meters that they support for their software. And then Azo kind of takes it even another step. You can buy monitors that even have a colorimeter built into them, and you can sort of enter the targets you want and allow Azo to kind of walk through this process. Now, we can get into how accurate those become if you start comparing like the built-in calibration and the probe. They're only as accurate really as the gear you're using. If you're using a colorimeter, there may be some error if the colorimeter isn't optimized specifically for that display's technology. And again, that's becoming smaller and smaller as colorimeter manufacturers start to improve their reference tables for different displays, like an LCD with an RGB LED backlight, or with a CCFL backlight, or an OLED, or plasma, things like that. But again, there's really, in the Rec 709 world, and any broadcast world, I would recommend using a broadcast monitor over that. But if you're a visual effects artist, if you're an editor, if you're someone that's like, well, I don't really need the client monitor, I'm really creating on the computer, then you can look at something like the Dream Color, the Azo. And again, there's many computer monitors out there that you could look at. Dell has some computer monitors. I'm not going to say, again, lower cost, right? And so there's caveats to lower cost monitors. But again, Rec 709 is not very hard to hit on these. And if you're not doing that final color grade, you really just need to be in that ballpark. You've got to be consistent from artist to artist. You've got to be consistent from station to station. You've got to be close enough where when you do look at it in a grading suite, you don't go, what did we do? Why is this cape purple when we thought it was red? That is where I think more importantly we see things coming into play in animation, in visual effects, where people are just working on that computer monitor. But if you're color grading, if you're even editing and you have clients in the room and you want to have that broadcast monitor, I don't really recommend using the computer monitor. They're really geared around the computer system, full range video, sRGB formats. And then you can also get into what we call issues with, it's always been referred to as video overlay, and I think that's pretty much what a lot of tech guys like me still refer to it as, which is where you have a GUI window over the operating system. So just like you would have your DaVinci Resolve window over your Mac OS where you can move it around, you see the operating system, it's basically rendering the video over that OS, and you can get gamma shifts, color shifts, things like that. And the computer's designed to be a full range format, and what we work in for Rec 709 is often a legal range format, so that you can get a shift between that as well. As software has become more sophisticated, right, these have actually become less and less. We've actually seen software developers and operating systems start to separate and do transcodes and do different things to make sure that that window, the video in the window, looks right in that other space, which is pretty impressive. And it's becoming less and less of an issue, but I still wouldn't trust it for color grading. I would use like a Blackmagic card or an Aja card to output a clean video signal that's not overlaid over the OS to a broadcast monitor. So hey, I can see my levels on a scope. I know what I'm outputting. I know my monitor's set up right. There is nothing in between that could be introducing any type of conversion or skewing or truncation of the signal, those types of things. So that's kind of the long-winded, I guess, answer. But I would really only use a computer monitor, again, if you're working on a computer monitor. Like, again, photography, visual effects, animation, you're creating on the monitor itself in a program that's a PC program, meant to be on a computer monitor. And then from there, anything that's really not meant for that, I would always yield to a broadcast signal chain and workflow and monitor itself.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because there are some projects out there, and I'm sure you have clients like this, that their projects are only destined to be viewed on the web or on a phone, but nobody can really determine what that is. There's no standard for what that should be. Do you have any general advice about how to monitor for those situations?
The best way to monitor for situations is to test it, right? You want to go through that process of, if you're watching it in YouTube on an iPad, you want to actually try to watch it in YouTube on an iPad, and then you can kind of make your judgment of, are you happy with it? But what we found with most of the studios we work with when these things come up is if you follow most sites like Netflix and YouTube, they have a best practice, right? How to encode your content for viewing on YouTube. And if you follow it, it actually does a pretty good job for most of these websites is what we've found. And they might be a little different, right? Like you might want to start with full range on one. You might want to start with legal range on another. You might have to put some info frame data that says, hey, I'm Rec 709 legal, so that their software will then tell their player that this is Rec 709 legal, and it will do the proper playback. That's what we have found. But of course, every display is different, and you may have someone watching it on one display that's a little more green than another display. So, if those displays aren't calibrated the same, it probably won't look exactly the same, even if you're watching the same content in the same viewer on the same thing. And that's where it starts to get really tricky, right? Customers nowadays, more and more people are mobile, and more people want to, watch that rough cut and give notes on their iPad because they're running around, they're on set, they're looking at dailies and whatnot, and it does become a problem. And I think there are some companies out there that have started to provide solutions where they help with the encode, they help with the distribution, and they kind of make sure that you have a good signal path across the board when you're working internally, at least. A company like Pix, you may have heard of Pix, Josh, out of San Francisco. A lot of studios are using that, we see, and of course they're controlling a lot of the workflow and a lot of the distribution. And, you're using a Pix app to play it. You're using Pix to encode it and decode it. And, they're working on those technologies, and they're really focused on, we want to make sure that the levels are right. We want to make sure the color is right. We want to make sure that, from A to B, people are seeing it the way it's supposed to be seen. But then you get to a YouTube, and then, things happen. You get to YouTube, you get to these other services that are out there, and you really have to follow those guidelines. I think my advice is follow the guidelines, check it out yourself. You can always we've had clients that run test patterns, color bars, and various things, and then they'll bring it back and try to scope it out and say, did this shift, let's put gray ramps, shallow ramps through it, and let's see how did that come back, and really go from there. But I think most of the problems that we find when a client gets in trouble with that is because somewhere along the lines they weren't following the best practice, or there was a setting someplace that they didn't realize, and they were exporting something in the wrong file format, and then that file format was being converted to something else, and that's where the problem occurred. And so, okay, now you have to export it in this file format because that's the best file format for what it wants, and then we find out we don't have the problem. So it's just experimenting and going through those stages. And again, if you're looking at it on different displays and those displays aren't calibrated, you can add in more issue over time with it.
Right. So that's the low end. Now let's move over to the high end, which would be now HDR is the new hotness. And how is HDR changing the way that you do calibrations?
HDR is an entirely new target. We have our Rec 709 HD target, we have our Rec 2020 Ultra HD target, and now we have our HDR target. And as you may know, it uses a different target. We wouldn't really call it gamma anymore, but what we used to refer to as gamma, we now refer to as most often, I think, the electro-optical transfer function, or the EOTF. And so we're targeting a whole different system, and it's actually fallen into place faster than I expected. what happens in HDR is as you are, in the electro-optical transfer function, it's sort of dynamic based on the display and the display's capabilities. So for example, you could master at 1,000 nits, you can master at 4,000 nits. Now let's say you have a display like the Dolby that you mastered something at 4,000 nits at, and you have in the data, the info frame data, and some people refer to as metadata, but some people will tell you that's incorrect. You'd have this data that says, hey, this was mastered at 4,000 nits, and the display can only do 1,000 nits. So the display would then look at that and actually do tone mapping where it'll roll it off. And the roll off is, to my understanding today, it's sort of the Wild West. So the manufacturers will roll off based on the capability of their display because they know the capability of their display, right? So to make a standard that says, well, we're going to roll off this here and that there doesn't necessarily work if, an LG OLED can do 700 nits and a Samsung can do 1,200 nits and a Sony can do 1,500 nits, let's say. The roll off should be different there because they have different capabilities. And so in mastering the content, just to be clear, we don't roll off. In mastering the content, we master the content like a colorist like yourself is going to master the content and work within whatever the display is capable of. Now, the display is capable of 1,000 nits. You're working at 1,000 nits. You then put that data into your master, into your encode, and when it plays back, the display then says, oh, this is 1,000 nits. Well, I'm only capable of 700 nits, so I'm going to roll off from wherever the manufacturer sort of decides, let's say 500 nits to 700 nits, and they start rolling off to try and compress the extra 300 nits of brightness of luminance that are in that image into that space so that you're not hard clipping. You're not clipping stuff that should be in the image, but you're trying to make it fit within what you can do. The beauty of that is, let's say you buy a better TV a couple of years down the road that can do 1,000 nits. Well, now you rewatch your movie and you go, wow, this movie actually looks better. It looks better because now I'm not having to roll off. I'm able to get more of that brightness. I'm getting more of what the original intent of that content was. The electro-optical transfer function for HDR, the PQ curve that people would refer to as, that is sort of fixed in production, but then it sort of changes in the consumer, in reproduction, let's say. It is a living, breathing thing, HDR, and it does make it a little more difficult, but at first we're sort of, well, what are we supposed to target because we can't hit Rec 2020? Not really any displays hit Rec 2020, so do I target Rec 2020? And, the industry very quickly said, you know what? Rec 2020 is a container. We can go up to Rec 2020 really within the system. And right now, we'll just fill that container with what we can fill it with. And it's sort of become best practice to work in the P3, D65 color space targets. But it's not necessarily the limitation, right? So if you have a display that can hit P3, you target P3, and then you put in your encode, you put this data in there, and then the TV knows, oh, red is this red, right? And then the calibration of the display, you calibrate the display to a target, and then the display then remaps within that. So I can calibrate the display to a target, and I can even calibrate a display in HDR targeting a consumer display, a reproduction display, let's say, not a broadcast display, to P3. But if it goes beyond P3, it's still okay because I'm just getting it so that the scale is right. And so once this red is where this red should be, then you're hoping the other red where that red should be is there, even if, do you know what I mean? So it's going to move around. So you basically map the display and say the display is mapped properly. And then if you have less data, it's going to map it. And if you have more data, it's going to map it. But the display is mapped properly and it's hitting the standard as close as it should hit the standard. And then as titles come out with more information, it'll take advantage of that information if it can. And if it can't take advantage of that information, it's going to try to do tone mapping to then make it so that that information looks as good as it possibly can on that display. And that's sort of the beauty of it. Whereas Rec 709 and even Rec 2020, they were built more as fixed systems. We had Rec 709 and this was the red of Rec 709, this was the green, and that was the blue. And if you couldn't quite do it, you couldn't quite do it. And that's what it was. And we didn't really remap to anything, and of course some things might have been mastered on something that wasn't quite capable and then be played back as Rec 609, maybe look a little more saturated than it originally did because it was mastered on a Rec 601 SIMP-DC monitor and vice versa, so we kind of had that. But with HDR, they've really tried to make the people who have architected have really tried to make it very dynamic and say, okay, well, as technology gets better, we're going to grow into this technology. And as mastering technology gets better, there'll be more information there. And then your display will take advantage of it as it can. So in terms of calibration, we kind of target the standard, right? And that standard will be dependent on the capability of the display. And the display is just going to roll with it from there to then take the data and read the information. Of course, the caveat is if you have bad information on your disk, then, if the master is, that wasn't set up properly, there was no color gamut target, color space of mastering put on the disk itself, then, the display has to interpret, and then you might get further errors. But in broadcast, we kind of try to do as much as we can to get as close to that target. We hard clip it, and then we just take that information and put it within the master.
Right. It's interesting, too, because a lot of people are using, or they want to use monitors like the new LG OLEDs that do HDR for actual production work, too. But it sounds like it's actually doing some interpretation, as you say, from, that's not exactly a certain nit level.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about, what you're referring to is the ability to turn off the tone mapping.
Yes.
So in a consumer display, on most consumer displays, you're unable to do so. The tone mapping is turned on. It's part of the specification. It's really something you actually should have on a consumer display, right? But in broadcast monitors, there really isn't tone mapping. And you have the hard clip. And again, when you're mastering something, you don't want that moving target, right? You don't want to use, let's say, an LG OLED or a Samsung LCD or a Sony LCD or whatever brand you want to use, not to disparage anyone. But you don't want to use one as a client monitor that has the tone mapping turned on. And then you're sort of fighting in your grade against what the display is trying to compress in and tone map to the display's capabilities. So now you've color graded, you've mastered your content to a very specific display and that algorithm of tone mapping that manufacturer created. And that's what we want to avoid. The only manufacturer I know to date, and there may be more, and I know more are coming. So, by the time this airs, maybe there's going to be more out there already. But Sony actually has a model, the Z9D LCD. And that has a mode you can go into that disables the tone mapping. It does the hard clip. So you actually can use that as a client monitor per se. Again, it's a consumer display. It's not as good as like a Sony BVMX300, but you could use that as a client monitor and know that, okay, we don't have the tone mapping here. We are clipping at the same point as our BVMX300. You can actually set it to clip at the 1,000 nits like you would a BVMX300 and have them a little more in sync with one another in terms of tone mapping than, let's say another consumer display that you can't turn the tone mapping off. But there are some ways you can kind of get around it. You can find out where the display may start its tone mapping, and then you can sort of trick it by sending it the info frame data saying that, hey, I'm mastered at 500 nits, and the display, if it's mastered at 500 nits, that's the sweet spot, and so it doesn't do any tone mapping. And so as long as you send it the right data, you can actually make just about any display not tone map. But you'd have to send that data and make sure you're sending that data to the display instead of just putting it in a mode and then you just kind of work and you don't have to worry about it. Again, that can become an issue. And so in color grading, it is really hard to find, I think, a good client monitor for HDR today. I think most of our clients that are trying to use a quality monitor are going with something like the Z9D, again, because it is easy to disable the tone mapping on it, and the results are pretty good from the Sony Z9D. Not to say that other monitors aren't being used out there. There are certainly other brands that people are looking at. And then there are companies that are, studios that have a bunch of them, and they like to look at the final content to see sort of how the tone mapping is, right? They're like, well, we know we're mastering this, but how is the consumer really going to see this? Let's play back and see what it does and sort of see what's going on out there so we have a more realistic view, because again, it's a dynamic system. So it's not just master to this one standard and then everything's going to look great. You almost want to know, well, okay, I'm going to master the standard, but then what are these people doing with it? And so we do see a few studios, a lot of the larger studios that are out there that are buying multiple monitors and just looking at it, for no other reason than to say we want to research it. We want to see what's out there and what's going on and sort of get an idea. And I think for the most part, manufacturers are doing a great job. I think for the most part, we're in the infancy stages and you expect there to be problems and issues and compatibility and little details that kind of have to get worked out and tweaked. But I think it's going faster certainly than like HD implementation went and Blu-ray and HD DVD and all those things went. I think just technology in general, right, moves faster and faster, it seems, every year. So I think with this rollout has been pretty impressive because I had questions like 2-3 years ago when it was starting to come. It's like, well, what do I target? How am I calibrating for my clients? What do I need to worry about? And we would talk to companies behind HDR and even, go to SMPTE conferences and people were like, well, we're still working on this. Oh, well, this is what we're doing, but is that a standard? Because, as a service provider, I want to come in and let's say work on your system, Josh, and say, okay, this is how it needs to be. And then you want to go to your client and say, no, this is how it needs to be because this is the spec. But when it was first rolling out, the spec was sort of there, but it had a lot of holes. There weren't all these little things defined. And then, we were wondering like, well, what about tone mapping? And at first there were displays that didn't even like implement tone mapping because it wasn't even quite a thing in the beginning. I think the early tone mapping was really done by Dolby. Dolby was the Dolby Vision system was sort of having tone mapping, and that sort of has now trickled into HDR. And now HDR is starting to do tone mapping as well. But at first it was sort of, well, there is no tone mapping. So does that mean we're clipping on another display? And so you just get all these questions and then what's best practice and what's the right way to do it? What's the way we can say this is the specification? And this sort of reminds me of like gamma, when display gamma wasn't defined in Rec 7, I was only the camera gamma. And we all just kind of said, oh, well, 2.2 in, 2.2 out, and people would use 2.2. But the CRTs were not 2.2, right? The Sony CRTs, the JVCs, they weren't 2.2. So any mastering on those wasn't quite 2.2. But then we got flat panels and we were using 2.2. And then the new standard came out, right? Rec 18A6 came out and sort of more defined gamma. And I think we're going to look at HDR a little bit like that, as these little questions are being finalized, you're going to see amendments and you're going to see updates and you're going to see better best practices coming out, but it's moving super fast and it's a lot easier to get consistency, I think, in HDR from facility to facility than it was in the beginning with other technologies and other standards, 10, 15, 20 years ago as we were working with different display technologies and different capabilities and different formats.
So we're coming up now. This is being recorded just before NAB 2017. You will be there at the Colorist Mixer. If you want to say hey to Dave, he'll be there. So in your opinion, what are monitors today still lacking? Where do you see the future going for monitors?
That's a great question. Where do I see the future of monitors? The display technologies themselves are getting really good. And what I think, at least from my clients, what they really want and what I talk to manufacturers, I think they really want to give them is larger format color grading quality, right? Like grade A color grading monitors that can do 3840 by 2160, right? What most people refer to as 4K, and some people would say it's not 4K, it's 3840 by 2160 or 2160p. There's a lot of monitors on the market now, the 24-inch, 25-inch, 30-inch monitors that are 1920 by 1080. And as we start moving into these higher resolution formats, 3840 by 2160, I think there's a lot of pressure on the industry right now, especially the broadcast industry, to come out with review monitors, with work monitors, right, for guys like yourself that are 3840 by 2160 and can do these new formats and are affordable. We have the Sony BVMX 300, beautiful monitor. I think just about I have not heard one person tell me they don't love that monitor, right? And we've had other monitors on the market that are, $25,000 plus monitors that you could use as a grade A color grading monitor. But the vast majority, I think, of the industry can't necessarily afford $25,000, $30,000 a monitor in every room. And so we see a lot of colors still using 1920 by 1080, 24, 25, similar sized monitors out there. I think the future is going to be bringing that higher resolution and more capability, higher capability monitors that are doing 1,000 nits and whatnot to a more affordable price point. I don't know if we'll see that in NAB. I'm kind of interested to see who and what has what in NAB. And then I think the other thing that we really want to see is we want to see a better client monitor. I mean, that's a huge problem. When Panasonic got out of the plasma business and we saw the plasma displays go away that could have the SDI inputs, right, the Pro Series plasmas, it became a real sore point for the industry because the industry is like, well, we need more client monitors, or this monitor broke down, or we're expanding, or whatever reason they needed these client monitors. And today, you can't really get a very affordable SDI input monitor that's of the color grading quality that a lot of people would like. Now, there are monitors out there. Some of them are very good, but when you think, well, I want a 3840 by 2160 monitor, those become very limited or very expensive. So we see a lot more people going towards the consumer monitors, right? An LG OLED and putting a LUT box on it, or a Sony and maybe a LUT box, maybe not a LUT box on it, and finding solutions to fill the void of that more affordable monitor that has that capability. And what I'd love to see in the industry is to see some of these broadcast manufacturers coming out with a display so we don't have to do that. Something where we can have a 55-inch OLED color grading grade monitor with SDI in and all the bells and whistles we like as broadcast industry. The ability maybe to load LUTs into it, and the ability to have different formats that you can switch between very easily. I'd love to see that stuff. And I think that's where we, as a broadcast industry, need to go. As a consumer industry, it seems to be better, cheaper, more energy efficient, more apps, more integrations. That seems to be, the Samsungs, LG, Sonys, Vizios of the world. It's all about the smart TV. Certainly they're working with Energy Star, and they need to keep making them more energy efficient. They want to make them thinner, lighter, brighter, wider color gamuts, those types of things. And I think we're going to keep seeing them trying to push the envelope and get closer to that Rec 2020. I think we'll see broadcast try to do that too. But if broadcast doesn't have a 55-inch SDI monitor at an affordable price point, it doesn't really matter what the color gamut is, because I can't afford a $30,000 monitor, right? There's a lot of, I think, listeners that probably say that, yeah, I could go out and buy a $30,000 monitor, but I can't afford that. I'm looking more in the $10,000 range. And so I think that's really key to broadcast. But on the consumer side, I'm excited to see what quantum dots are going to do. I think OLED is probably going to be king. My personal opinion is I think OLED's going to be king for the next couple of years until we see native emissive quantum dot technology, and then that has the potential to really give OLED a run for its money. So in terms of the technology, I think it's going to be OLED for a little while as king of the castle, and then we might see quantum dots kind of pull forward. And obviously we're seeing that race right now of companies like Sony's on both sides of it now with their OLEDs, and Samsung's really hardcore into the quantum dots. And then we got LG, who's pretty much on both sides of it as well, but they're kind of leading with the OLED in terms of the video enthusiast world. So it's pretty exciting. I think the next few years we'll just see a lot of the bugs with HDR get worked out and more compatibility. And I think we're going to see the displays just get better and better.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave, for making the time. I know you're a super busy guy, so I really appreciate you making the time for me and coming on to the podcast. If people want to get in contact with you, where can they reach you?
I think the best way to get in touch with me is through our website, www.avical.com, AVICAL.com, and there is a contact form you could reach out to, and that would probably be the easiest, best way to get in touch with me.
Great. Thanks again, Dave.
All right. Thanks so much, Josh. Great talking to you.